Welcome to the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and to our series, Envisioning India. I'm James Foster, Vice Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs, welcoming you to our conversation today with Jayant Sinha, Chairperson of the Standing Committee on Finance and Member of Parliament, who will present Getting India to the Green Frontier. Thank you for sharing your insights and expertise with us today, Jayant. We are joined today by a remarkable panel of discussants. First, Nitin Desai, who has had a remarkable career in public service, including as Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India and as founding Undersecretary General of DESA, Department of Economic and Social Affairs of the UN. And second, Mohua Mukherjee, who is no stranger to the neighborhood, having had a long and distinguished career with the World Bank and later with the International Solar Alliance. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here with us. I'll be moderating today's event in the Elliott School's Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP, which last year initiated the Envisioning India series, producing 10 amazing episodes with all-star casts. The usual moderator, Institute Director Jay Shambo, was called away to Capitol Hill and couldn't join us today. He sends his regards and plans to watch the video. In just a moment, series creator Ajay Chibber, who is also distinguished visiting scholar at IIEP, will set the stage for today's event and formally introduce our guests. But first, I'd like to thank the co-sponsors of today's event for their continued support. The Seeger Center for Asian Studies at the Elliott School and IIEP's Executive Circle, co-chaired by Frank Wong and Deborah Lair. Now, for those of you who haven't attended a previous IIEP event at the Elliott School, you can expect a nonpartisan, lively, and informative conversation on such topics as US-China economic relations, multidimensional poverty, climate change, and digital trade. Later today, at noon Eastern, two of our series, Facing Inequality and Rethinking Capitalism and Democracy, will converge to present inequality and the centrifugal nature of the labor market with philosopher Peter Deitch. Our next episode of Envisioning India is October 20th and will feature JP Morgan's Sajid Chinoy presenting India's Economy in a Post-Pandemic World with discussion by Poonam Gupta and Shankar Acharya. And a few weeks back, Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus joined us once again at the Elliott School for a presentation entitled Poverty, Climate, and Unemployment Towards a World of Three Zeros. This and all our events are recorded and made available on our YouTube channel, IIEP GW. Now let me turn the mic over to my distinguished colleague and creator of the series, Ajay Chibber. Professor.
Thank you very much, James, and welcome to all of you, but welcome especially to our three very distinguished speakers today. I'm so glad that we get to start the 21-22 Envisioning India series with such a stellar cast of speakers and on a topic which I think is very, very timely. Getting India to the green frontier, just before the COP conference, and just as we were speaking a little while back, that how much disasters and shocking weather we are seeing all around the world, whether we are in India, or whether you're in the United States, or for that matter, anywhere in the world. So I'm so delighted to start the 21-22 series with this particular topic and this cast of speakers. Let me, James has already started some of the introductions, but let me just say welcome to you, Nitin. Nitin Desai is, in my mind, that very rare breed of policymakers, thinkers, economists, that, that rare combination that you have very few of those in any country. And Nitin is one of those. As James has said, he has already served for 10 years as the Undersecretary General for Economic and Social Affairs. He was Chief Economic Advisor more importantly, he was the pen that wrote the Brundtland Commission report that got us all actually started down this path many years back. So welcome to you, Nitin. And to my former colleague, also Mohua Mukherjee. She's probably the youngest and one of the brightest young professionals. She was one of the youngest young professionals at the World Bank, I remember, and one of the brightest. And her last position, she was heading the World Bank's project on the Solar Alliance, on India's solar project. She's been program and brand ambassador for the International Solar Alliance. So very special welcome to you, Mohua, as well. And of course, to our main speaker, Jayant Sinha, who's not only the chair of the parliamentary committee, but he's been Minister of State for Finance. He's been Minister of State for Civil Aviation. He's twice elected member of parliament from Hazaribagh. He's actually speaking from Hazaribagh today. And he's had, of course, a very distinguished career in the private sector. He has an MBA from Harvard. And more importantly, he is an IIT alumni, and he got the alumni award from IIT for his distinguished career as well. So over to you, Jayant, to start us off, and then I've handed back to, after that, to James to chair the session. So over to you, Jayant.
Thank you very much, Ajay, and a very good evening to everyone who's participating in what I think will be a very absorbing set of discussions. I am very much looking forward to our interaction this evening. And as Ajay said, I'm joining you all from Hazaribagh, and I apologized upfront to the other panelists about the uncertain electricity situation here. We are in the epicenter of coal production, but nonetheless, we do have periodic outages. So I'm hopefully not going to have too bad a problem, because I'm sitting here with an inverter and so on, but you never know. So if there is an outage, I'll get back to you all as quickly as I can. But thank you for being part of the set of discussions around India's green future. And this is a topic on which I have been working on for decades in my own professional life. But in the last 2 or 3 years, I've been looking at it with much more intensity and much more urgency for all the reasons that you know well. And also because I represent Hazaribagh in Jharkhand, which, as I was saying, is the epicenter of coal production in India right now. In fact, Hazaribagh and Chatra and Ramgarh districts, when I represent Hazaribagh and Ramgarh districts, now produce more coal than Dhanbad does. So both in terms of what the grassroots and the ground realities are associated with coal production, as well as what it means for India's development and for the global issues that we're dealing with respect to climate change. This is something that has really been very, very important for me and of vital interest to me. So I have put together a presentation where I try and describe what India's development model should be in light of the need for us to urgently reduce our carbon emissions while at the same time creating jobs. And I'd like to take you through that presentation for maybe 20-25 minutes. And then, of course, we'll move to the discussion phase of this evening's program. So let me start with that. I will put up this presentation, and you'll see I'll try and address the issues both of climate change as well as job creation, which also is vitally important for India's development. So let me share my screen. So hopefully you all can see this, but basically my headline is that net zero is net positive. And I genuinely believe that net zero is net positive for India. There are many shades of opinion on whether India should strive for net zero or not. I believe that there is some flexibility in terms of when we should get to net zero. It could be For example, in 2047, which is when we have 100 years of independence, it could be 2050, it could be 2060. But the trajectory has to change. We have to bend the curve with respect to carbon emissions. And this is such a major transformation for us. This requires us to do so many things that effectively this becomes our development model as well. And I have given it the name, the Green Frontier Development Model, because even as we are reducing carbon, we also have to enhance our competitiveness. And that's why we have to be at the competitiveness frontier as well. So we've got to be green in our development and we have to be competitive in our development. And that's why I call it the Green Frontier Development Model. So let me take you all through that. But let me start with what the conventional view on development is today. And of course, we have a number of economists that are participating today and are listening in. And what I learned, at least in the economics of development course that I did, was that really it's farm to factory is the conventional development model that all countries have followed. And that's been driven by two vectors, industrialization and urbanization. Classic example, of course, of China recently, where people have gone from the paddy fields to the factories, and it's been driven by industrializing and urbanizing. And that is the model that everybody expects India to follow as well. And if you step back from the pictures and start to look at the economics of this, really you have to think of it in terms of the production possibility curve as to what an economy can do. And in this case, I've set the trade-off as the planet on the one hand, which is the state of our natural resources, and people on the other hand, which is really about what people care about: jobs, wealth, GDP, output, etc. And if you look at the production curve, when everybody's in the farm, you use technology to improve production, and we produce a certain amount of output given the technology that we have. And that progresses over time as technology improves. And that's really the way we have to think about development. And so we go from farm to factory. Production increases as we improve technology usage, our productivity increases. And basically the thinking has been that this is a upward sloping graph where both our natural carrying capacity is increasing because we are doing well for the planet and we are doing well for people at the same time. And so this is the way this kind of development should proceed. The reality, of course, as we know, is that it's moving in the wrong direction right now. So even as we are going from farm to factory, the path that we are following is resulting in certain developmental challenges that are proving to be quite vexing. You can make the argument that the COVID pandemic that we've dealt with, these zoonotic viruses that have spilled over from mammals, from animals to human beings, is because we are encroaching on their natural habitats. And as we do that, and as we get closer and closer to where these natural habitats are, we will have more of these zoonotic viruses that are going to spill over. Obviously, we are concerned about carbon emissions, but there are other issues around, for example, water shortages, land scarcity, air pollution. And even as we are moving from farm to factory in India, as many observers have pointed out, it's resulting in insufficient job creation. And so really this development model of farm to factory is not working very well for us. And we know the story on carbon emissions, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But of course, the IPCC has laid out very clearly that the trajectory we are on is not sustainable. Current policies, even with the Paris NDCs, are going to result in global temperatures by 2100 getting to somewhere between 2.7 to 3.1 degrees centigrade, when we really have to head to net zero so that we can maintain the 1.5 degrees centigrade target that we committed ourselves to in Paris. So right now, when we look at carbon emissions, we are not on a sustainable trajectory. We really have to bend the curve and we have to get down to net zero. Now, let me be very clear. I'm not a Malthusian at all. And I'm not a believer in doom and gloom scenarios. I'm very much a techno-optimist. I'm a technologist. But I think it's time to act. I think it's time to use technology and bend the curve, because obviously the trajectory we're on is not sustainable as of now. And here's the very interesting fact when it comes to India. We've said, and every nation has committed to reaching net zero at some point. And globally, of course, people have already committed to net zero with all the major emitters, including China, saying that by 2060, they will get to net zero. They will peak by 2030. So even they have committed to a net zero target. India, on the other hand, even though we have committed ourselves and are overachieving our Paris NDCs, the reality is, and this is what all our modeling is showing, and I'm doing some very detailed modeling right now with very, very sophisticated and very high quality analytical models that we built now, that's showing that India's carbon emissions are at about 3.5 billion tons of carbon equivalents. Those, despite the 450 gigawatt target, despite our Paris NDCs, are going to continue to grow. There is no peaking in sight. In fact, it's linearly going up. And depending on what you think of GDP and carbon intensity and so on, we are going to be somewhere between probably 6 to 10 billion tons of carbon emissions by 2050. So that's the baseline trajectory that we're on right now. And clearly, this is not a sustainable situation either for the world or for us. If the world is going to net zero and we are going to be at 6 to 10 billion tons, we simply cannot be in a situation where we'll end up being 30, 40, 50% of global emissions by 2050. This is an inherently unsustainable situation, and something needs to happen to bend this curve. Now, even as we're dealing with carbon emissions and this existentialist issue of climate change, what we are dealing with in India as well is a jobs challenge of epic proportions. So here is Bhola Mehto. Bhola Mehto is one of my voters in Tati Jharia block in Hazaribagh. Bhola Mehto wants a good job. And he does not want a job working in a construction site as an informal worker. He doesn't want to come to Mumbai and work as a waiter in a dhaba. If he gets a job in the north, he wants to be, somebody who's working in government. This is a picture of an IAS officer. Or if he wants to go to the south, he wants to go to Bangalore and work in a white-collar environment in IT services. So Bhola Mehto wants a good job. That is the second big challenge that we're facing, along with the climate change challenge that we're dealing with. And of course, as you know, the numbers on formal sector jobs in India are actually very, very modest. Because we have 40% labor force participation rate. We've got about 400 million people based on the latest data that CMIE's put out that are in the workforce. 320 or so are in the informal sector. About 80 million are in the formal sector. And in the formal sector, 55 million are in the commercial sector. About 25 million are in government and government agencies and so on. So we've got only about 80 million people. We've lost about 8 million jobs. So we've got only about 80 million people in the formal sector. Those are the kinds of jobs that people want. That's the job that Bhola Mehto wants. He does not want to work in the informal sector. And even as we are dealing with the fact that we've got to move 320 million people from the informal sector and get them good jobs, get them into the formal sector, we have an additional 250 million people joining the workforce over the next 15 or 20 years. So we have a big jobs challenge ahead of us. Even as we're dealing with climate change, we can't deal with climate change in a way that results in less job creation because that absolutely is what we require for our economy. So even as we deal with these challenges, we need a model that really defines the way in which our economy can develop and our economy can progress from here. And what we can't do for Bhola Mehto, even though he wants a job, we can't take him in the farm where he's making about 7,000 rupees a month working in the farm and put him in a factory type job, have him drive an auto rickshaw, which is a petrol auto rickshaw, making 15,000 rupees a month. That type of a brown job is not something that I think is desirable either for Bhola or for India. And that, in fact, defines the current path that we are on. We are taking the Bhola Mehtos of India, we are putting them in these auto rickshaws and these kinds of informal jobs. That's not creating sufficient jobs. And it's, of course, leading to other issues such as carbon emissions, air pollution, traffic, and so on. So this path, as I said right at the outset, does not work. It doesn't work in terms of what we're doing for the planet, and it doesn't work for what we're doing for people, because all we're doing is creating more and more of these informal, insecure jobs. We really need to think differently. And this is where I start talking about India's green development model. And we need innovation-driven formal jobs. So what if instead of putting Bhola Mehto in an auto rickshaw, in an informal job, we make him an Ola or an Uber driver driving an electric vehicle, being dispatched by a mobile dispatch system, and getting his payments completely digitally, completely electronically through UPI. So if we can apply that innovation in Bhola's life, make him an Ola or Uber driver, and instead of driving people in an auto rickshaw in Tati Jharia, he starts using his Ola or Uber car to taking people in Hazaribagh and other areas to Ranchi, to the airport. Hopefully he'll be able to make a lot more money, and he'll make 50,000 rupees a month. So we need to create these green jobs that make a lot more money, that are much more, in the formal sector and with much better benefits than putting him in an informal job, which is a brown job, which is fundamentally unsustainable. And so instead of the current path that we're on, the farm to factory path, that's resulting in this type of unsustainable development for India, we need to find the net zero pathways. We need to find the net zero pathways that get us to the green frontier. And at the green frontier, not only do we have net zero emissions, we have high job creation, robust economic growth, and our cities don't collapse. So we've got to explore and find these net zero pathways that will get us to the green frontier. And at the green frontier, not only are we able to reduce our carbon emissions down to zero, we are also highly competitive because we are building an economy that's based on innovation, that's based on technology, that is very frugal in the use of natural resources and highly productive, so people can earn more and people can continue to grow and develop their skills. So we really need to develop these net zero pathways. We need to really understand what those are like. And that is the pathway of continuous innovation. So if we can use these kinds of green jobs to leapfrog the factory stage of development, move to the green frontier stage of development, we can get people out of these informal jobs working as auto rickshaw drivers and make them Ola Uber drivers working through these kinds of electric vehicles and modern mobile driven systems. Now, the good news is that there is a whole range of industries that are carbon reducing, deep decarbonization industries, which enable us to meet our sustainable development goals and are also job creating. There's a whole host of industries that we need to emphasize, we need to prioritize. And if we do that, that will enable us to move down the net zero pathway. And in doing that, as we move down this net zero pathway, using innovation, using technology, we will build these competitive, sustainable, and resilient industries that are in fact at the green frontier. And there is a whole range of companies that are in fact already doing this right now, whether it is Ether, whether it is, as you know, Ola is building a factory for 2 million two-wheelers a year, which are going to be electric vehicles. And there's a whole range of other industries that are decarbonizing industries that are very efficient, very productive industries that are actually at the green frontier already. Now, I also want to tell you about the work that we are doing in modeling this green transformation that is going into understanding these net zero pathways. I began work about 2.5 years ago with 2 or 3 different modeling groups. One is at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, where they're using a model developed by Energy Innovation, which is based in California. This model has been used by the US and Chinese governments to really look at their green pathways, their net zero pathways. At the same time, I've also been working with the World Resources Institute in Bengaluru and the Shakti Foundation using the same model, but with different scenarios to look at, again, net zero pathways. And a similar modeling effort is underway by Cambridge Econometrics, which has been sponsored by the UK government. So, and in addition, even C-STEP in Bangalore is using its own in-house systems dynamic model to study these. Now, there's a lot of work still to be done. But even as we start to look at these net zero pathways and compare it to business as usual and low carbon pathways, what we are finding is that green technologies actually now are superior to brown technologies. They're better. Solar is better than coal, and electric vehicles are better than fossil fuel based vehicles. And as a result of that, if we invest in these green technologies and in these green industries, we are actually going to increase our GDP, increase job creation, and improve quality of life. Net zero is clearly the better development pathway. Net zero is in fact net positive. And at some level, all of the debates that we're having around carbon space are actually irrelevant, because the markets have spoken and technologies have spoken. This is the way we have to go. And of course, I've read Shri Nitin Desai ji's excellent paper that he wrote recently about carbon space. He makes very good points. But I think at some level, those discussions are almost moot. And in some level, even what's happening in Glasgow is almost moot, because for our own competitiveness and for our own people, we have to be on the net zero pathway, because that's where technology and market forces are taking us already. And here I'll just show you some of the early modeling results that we're getting. And we are getting remarkably consistent modeling results across these three different modeling groups. When we model GDP in the business usual case, and we compare that to GDP in the net zero case, what we're finding is that it's absolutely superior, and it is robust in every regard. GDP is actually higher in the net zero case than in the business as usual case. Similarly, Cambridge Econometrics has also looked at it. They are also finding the GDP is higher in the net zero case than in the business as usual case. When we look at jobs, we find, which is of course the other very important thing, and here the baseline that is being used by World Resources Institute is a very positive baseline. You can in fact make a case that the baselines that we're using need to be much more sort of negative, because if climate change proceeds as we expect, then the baseline may be far worse than we expect it to be. But even if we take a baseline where the average over the next 30 years CAGR for India as a GDP is close to 5%, even then the net zero cases are showing better GDP growth and higher job creation. And if we develop these green industries, what we found is that when we are developing high productivity industries, high growth industries, and industries that are directly at the frontier, there tends to be a very large multiplier effect. And for every one job we create directly, we create 3 other indirect jobs. And if we are able to leapfrog to these green industries, there is a very good chance that we will be able to deal with the jobs challenge also that we are facing right now, but it will require very significant investment on our part to be able to get there. Now, here's one of the very interesting aspects of going to a green development model, going to the green frontier model, and that is air pollution. Today, we have about 20 million deaths a year in India. And the WHO data and many research studies are showing that some 2.5 million of those deaths out of the 20 million, some 12% of the deaths that are being caused are actually being caused due to air pollution. And that's 60-70% driven by fossil fuels. So if we can bring down air pollution by eliminating fossil fuels, we can actually bring down deaths quite considerably that are being caused today by air pollution. So the quality of life improvement in our cities by us replacing fossil fuels by electric transportation is extraordinarily important. And of course, that the number of reported deaths through COVID is only 450,000. And we are losing every year 2.5 million people to air pollution. So this is a silent killer. We have to be able to deal with it in some fashion. And going to the green frontier is actually going to be very, very positive when it comes to air pollution as well. Now, to get these green industries to grow, obviously, there is a whole host of things you have to do. We are doing that in drones, for example, by building public platforms, the physical infrastructure itself, market infrastructure. So there's a lot of work you have to do to create these green industries. And of course, these industries go through the typical S-curve that you see all new industries go through. And government has an important role to play to jumpstart these green frontier industries. But this is fundamentally driven by market forces. It's fundamentally driven by private sector capital. Estimates of a green transformation in India, the early modeling is showing range between $100 to $150 billion a year. That's what's going to be required. So all the discussion on getting $100 billion a year through green financing from governments for the developing world, frankly, is very modest relative to the actual needs that a green transformation will require, and that money will have to come from the private sector. So the story really is about the private sector and the jumpstart of these green frontier industries by a rapid injection of investment by capital, and that will come by setting the right policy framework and attracting hundreds of billions of dollars of capital into India's green industries. And that's really the way the green transformation is going to happen. Now, to that effect, and I'm not going to get into the details here, I have proposed a private member net zero bill, which is modeled on the New Zealand and prior to that, the British Net Zero Act. But it's important to send a signal to the markets that we are committed to net zero. The target could be 2050, it could be 2060, but our policy framework and our policy direction has to be clear. We are committed to net zero, and we're committed to net zero because it's the right answer for competitiveness, it's the right answer for GDP growth, it's the right answer for jobs, and it's the right answer for the health of our people. And if we are able to do that, if we are able to innovate and attract investments into these green industries to the green frontier, we can take Bhola Mehto, we can put him in an Ola car and make him an Ola driver, but we can also make him part of a world-class global supply chain, like in the dairy industry, and enable him to increase his income dramatically, just staying where he is in his village. And it's not just a question of Bhola Mehto, it's also a question of Geeta Oraon. Geeta Oraon is a tribal Adivasi lady in a remote village in Hazaribagh. And if we can link her into these sophisticated supply chains, get her a robot, enable her to make customized dresses and use logistics to be able to pick that up and be able to plug her into a global supply chain, we can get Geeta Oraon also to make 50,000 rupees a month, but we need to take our people and we need to put them into these world-class supply chains. And that's why I'll conclude by saying that we are focused on Atmanirbhar Bharat, that Atmanirbhar Bharat has to be a net zero Bharat, a Bharat that is on a net zero pathway, and that is required for competitiveness, for our economy to be competitive. It's required for sustainability so that we leave a better world and a better future for our children. And it's also required for resilience so that our economy can deal with external shocks, because we will be able to stop the import of $150 billion worth of fossil fuels a year. We will strengthen our macroeconomic framework. We will increase our reserves, and we will have our own sources of energy supply. So I believe Atmanirbhar Bharat should be a net zero Bharat, and A and B equals CSR. In my formula here, A and B equals CSR. Net zero is net positive. I'll end here. Thank you very much, and look forward to our discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Jayant, for your positive vision where economic and climate needs converge, assuming a rapid injection of capital. Now I ask Nitin Desai to address the audience. Nitin.
Thank you very much. Let me first begin by thanking Jayant Sinha for what is a very, very useful and valuable contribution to the debate on this subject in India. And let me just say that I fully agree that in the long run, all of us have to be net zero. There is no way this world can survive if there is any carbon emission going on beyond in the second half of the century. So that has to be there. The point I would make is, it's not the end date of net zero that matters. It's the trajectory to that net zero. If you're going to continue emitting things and then say, oh, I'll reach net zero in 2060, 2070, 2050, it doesn't help. And I made this calculation that the 5 countries, USA, UK, EU, Japan, China, who have announced a net zero goal for their own self, till they reach net zero, from now till when they reach net zero, their combined emissions of carbon will be 485 gigatons of carbon, which is more than the balance that is available in the carbon budget for a 1.5 degree set, according to the IPCC. Because they're not moving fast enough immediately. That is the problem. So I quite agree that yes, we must move over to a vision of development which does not depend on carbon in any way. We may use carbon briefly, maybe for another 5-10 years in India, but we have to recognize that beyond that, it will have to be something which we will have to give up. What I find very valuable in Jayant Bhai's contribution is that he says this is not just something that you have to do because the environment is challenged. It is actually something which will help you from the point of view of what your development should be doing. which is to promote quality employment for the mass of our people. And that, I think, is a very valuable contribution to say that pursuing a net zero trajectory, I keep saying trajectory rather than end date, because I think that's what we ought to be pressing for, saying do far more immediately than what we are planning on doing, because just putting out a date for net zero by itself is not enough. And I'm very happy that Mr. Jayant Sinha has emphasized this, because in many ways what he's saying is that we ought to be looking at this not, yes, India has a challenge. India has a challenge that it is required to not imitate the modes of development which countries have followed in the 19th and 20th century, even though it is much poorer than those countries were even in the 20th century. And that's correct, that we cannot just be farm to factory. It has to be something, and we use the phrase leapfrog, and that's precisely it. We have to leapfrog into what is going to be the new economy, which is the economy that you, I think, very successfully described it. I would summarize in three things. One, it's an economy which will be much more decentralized because energy is going to be decentralized. Yes, we must remember this, that today part of our centralization of our economies is because of the dependence on fossil fuels, coal and food and petroleum. You are going to meet a world beyond 2050 where there will be no trade in coal or petroleum, when there will be nobody who will own the energy resources, which will be free: wind, solar power, water, flowing water. And that is what going to make a profound change to our economy, to our society also, which is something that we should recognize and leapfrog towards. Second, we are moving into a wiki economy. I call it a wiki economy. What I mean by this is an economy where things come not just from large plants, etc., but from the aggregation of small activities, small entrepreneurs coming together. Uber is an example, Ola is an example, Airbnb an example. And that wiki economy is going to expand. What we're seeing today in areas like which Uber covers, Ola covers, Airbnb, will happen in other areas. It's also an economy which is dependent on one of the great innovations of our century, the internet, and the system that it facilitates and allows. If you like, the e-commerce economy, the economy which allows distant communication between people and so on. And finally, the new technology economy that is coming in, the new technologies which are not quite what the old factory-based technologies were. So I completely agree with Jayant Bhai that we ought to be thinking of Indian development as leapfrogging beyond the old model of farm to factory into from farm to the new economy, which will be a very different economy, a knowledge-based economy, an economy based on quality employment of a very different sort from the sort that you could have provided in factories and so on. But this is the important stress I want to make is we should not get trapped in a pressure that will be on us now to announce a date for net zero. What we should be focusing on is the importance of every country in the world, not just India, recognizing that we need a much faster pace of movement towards this new economy than what we are doing at present. There are many barriers. There are many people with stranded assets who will resist this. But I believe this is in the interest of the vast majority of people, not just in India, but the world over. So I welcome Mr. Sinha's suggestion, and I quite agree with him that we have to recognize that it's not just a low carbon world that we will be living in, it's a zero carbon world that we have to live in. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussions afterwards.
Thank you for that complimentary, but also supporting vision of where we can be in the future, in fact, where we need to be in the future. I will then turn it now to comments from Mohua Mukherjee. Mohua?
Yes, thank you very much. I have a few slides. I put my comments onto some slides. So let me just jump right in with those. Yeah, I have, once we've agreed on the share of the global carbon budget and all the things that my two preceding speakers spoke about, whether the curve is steep or flat, how quickly we get to wherever we're going, we need to just look at what happens then, who does what. Mr. Sinha had started to speak about this, and in terms of how do we actually get there. So let me just pursue that particular line of discussion. Let's remember one thing, that the average per capita electricity consumption, for example, somebody like Bhola Mahato, who is one of Mr. Sinha's voters, probably consumes about 100 kilowatt hours per capita per annum. And urban electricity consumption is about 12 times that in India. The global average is 4,000, and the USA 12,000, Canada 13,000. So the aspirations that Mr. Sinha spoke about are very, very important, because rural demand surveys have said people want refrigerator, air conditioner, personal computer, they want an extra TV, extra fan, etc. So I'm interested in looking at the idea that Mr. Sinha did not have time to go into, which is the Climate Change Commission he proposed. What would that Climate Change Commission need to play as a super coordinator? And I'm going to, if I have time, quickly look at the rooftop PV as one example of what the government is already doing, what the government still needs to do, and come to green jobs, if I may. I just want to focus on this slide, even if I don't get to say anything else. These are my 4 key takeaways. I believe that at the moment in India, there isn't enough public awareness of this kind of strategy that both Mr. Sinha and Mr. Desai spoke about, in the sense that people really understand. They may have heard of solar energy and wind energy, but the fact that, exactly as the 2 speakers said, you're incentivized for your own reasons, your cost saving, reduced waste, better air quality, increased resilience, better inclusion, better future for your kids. All of these messages have not really been woven together for the Indian public, member of the public at large, in terms of understanding why they should get on board with this. So what we're really missing is a big communication strategy that also looks at the biodiversity aspects, the nature, natural capital, and so forth. I want to say that we also need, apart from the public awareness, a clear-eyed understanding of what is the residual green premium. If we change to green technologies, what is that extra incremental cost? I know that Mr. Sinha said we don't need to ask anybody for money because we should just do it. I mean, this 100 billion a year for Paris is very little compared to what we need. So there's no point in really wasting time asking for the money. But I still think that the money can really help in certain, parts of the economy that are not of interest to the mainstream private sector. So I think we should get this residual green premium funded by the India's share of this Article 6 payment of the Paris Agreement. As the preceding speakers have said, the mitigation is important, but that alone won't get us to the green frontier. It's like the DNA, the double helix strand. We have a lot of other strands. We have biodiversity, water conservation, social inclusion, and we also need things like traceability of raw materials, kind of like a scope 3. Instead of just being for electricity, we also need it for biodiversity. Without that, if we just keep pushing on the mitigation and reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, we won't really get there. Businesses need to report their impact. So far, we have the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate Financial Disclosure. We also need something for natural capital financial disclosure and social. We need Indian adaptations for the Forestry Stewardship Council, the responsible sourcing of palm oil, all these types of standards, labels, and certifications that work in an Indian context in order to bring in that private sector that Mr. Sinha spoke about, the level playing field, where everybody has to report these things and we can bring in very large amounts of capital if everybody is playing by the same rules. We also have a very convenient CO2 equivalent for climate mitigation. We don't have something like that yet for the biodiversity and the natural capital. So can the government help with through this Climate Change Commission, coming up with some leadership on this overall a bundled metric that looks at all the aspects which are needed to get us to the green frontier. And the fourth point is intentional and deliberate coordination. We have multiple layers of government. What I find, what always strikes me is, for example, if you take something as simple as weather data, we are it's already paid for. The Indian government has, extensive weather meteorological data and so forth. Yet every private sector generator has to come up with their own weather forecast. They're penalized if they have a deviation from their forecast. It's needed for energy storage planning and so forth. We have diesel consumption at the block level, which is the lowest administrative unit. We already are spending public funds for training women to do green jobs. We already have, I think the UPI system was mentioned by Mr. Sinha. The government can very quickly roll out something akin to a blockchain system for agricultural traceability. These kinds of things I see as the role of government in getting us there through a public-private partnership. And maybe the Climate Change Commission can help to coordinate these things. I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to quickly say that we have some good practices that are already happening. Let's remember that the electricity distribution companies are actually what delivers the clean energy to everybody. So they are being fixed through an ambitious reform program. We have energy storage tenders that are of interest to many countries in the world that are innovative, bundling energy generation and energy storage. We have e-mobility. We have inclusiveness, training women drivers of three-wheelers. In the state of Kerala, in Cochin, we have an effort to employ transgender people in the metro system. So there are these various little green shoots of innovation, inclusiveness, and so on happening. We have a cooling action plan, which many countries don't have, because space cooling demand will contribute 40% to India's energy peak. So we need to get in front of that. The Prime Minister has a sustainable green affordable housing program, and Indian corporates, particularly in cement and aluminium, are sitting right at the top table in terms of other private sector companies that are looking how to get to the green frontier. But a lot more needs to happen that I won't go through those, but if anybody's interested, please feel free to see the slides later. Just wanted to say the MSME sector is a main job creator in India, one of the main ones. And one of the initiatives that people are trying to do now is to see how MSMEs can reduce their energy bill by having rooftop solar, for example. And that in itself, just that one single effort is throwing up a huge number of challenges of coordination mainly, and bringing in the financial sector to fund it and the risk mitigation that's needed. So this is another important role that Mr. Sinha's Climate Change Commission could play. Again, these are some ideas. I just want you to see on this graph how low India's rooftop solar is, that's the red bar, compared to the yellow bar, which is the ground mounted. And in India, land is an issue, so we really need to increase that rooftop solar percentage. We have all these risks, the different risk profiles of the MSMEs, and I'll stop there. So we have a lot of each one of these. If you just look into them, there are numerous things to do. A lot of them are a matter of coordination. So I strongly welcome the idea of the Climate Change Commission. We do need something like that. Thank you so much. Over.
Well, thank you so much, Mohua. This was really the practical underpinnings of the way forward through your step-by-step guide through innovation for getting there and for the chance of moving forward beyond. Let me now turn it over to the audience because, well, actually, I'm not going to go directly to the audience. I'll just let the audience know that this is a great time to think about putting your questions into chat and then Let me give it back to Jayant for responding to our discussions.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you to Nitin Bhai and Mohua ji for their commentary. Nitin Bhai is of course correct that climate justice would argue that the limited carbon space that is available right now should be used by the developing countries to do as much of their development using fossil fuels as they can. However, what the technology analysis is telling us right now, Nitin Bhai, is that today, independent of any restrictions as far as carbon is concerned, suppose I had no carbon restrictions, no carbon constraint, and I had to decide on levelized solar energy, levelized in the sense of having both solar and battery storage. So I have non-stop 24/7 electricity coming from solar or from wind, and between base load, coal-fired thermal power plant, ultra mega power plant, etc., using the latest technologies. If I had a choice between round-the-clock solar and round-the-clock coal, independent of carbon, I would pick round-the-clock solar. It's actually cheaper, and that's before I price in the negative externalities of coal and the positive externalities of solar coming from carbon and being more labor-intensive and so on. Just purely on a price basis, where we are with respect to technology is that people will pick solar over coal. So we don't really even, and that is true for electric transportation as well. So that today, the total cost of ownership of electric vehicles is lower than that of fossil powered vehicles. And that is the case for many other industries, green buildings, for example, as well. There are many sectors of the industry like cement and steel, where we don't have good substitutes for coal or fossil fuels in general. But let's get to those later. We can, over the next 10 years, completely transform our energy generation, our electricity generation. We can completely transform our transportation sector. We can completely transform construction, just purely driven by technology and market forces, and not even worry about some of these other industries, because 10 years from now, green hydrogen will end up, as Mukesh Bhai has already said, that he's going to bring it down to $1 per kg. At that point, maybe green hydrogen will be the best solution for cement and steel as well. So we should let market forces work. We should let innovation work. These are inherently more job creating industries in and of themselves. And rather than wasting our time worrying about carbon space and so on, let's focus our energies on how we can be innovative, how we can be competitive. And I speak as an engineer, not as an economist, right? So I'd rather want to go out and develop these technologies and really go in and build these industries and make them happen, because I know that these technologies are better than fossil-based technologies, better than the brown technologies. So who cares about that? That's irrelevant now. It's moot. Let's just go pick the best technologies, make them more productive and better over time, and let's go. And if we send the right signals and if we have the right policy frameworks, we resolve the coordination issues that Mohua ji is talking about, markets will rip. Already, there's a huge amount of green capital that's waiting to be deployed. The best returns, the biggest bang for the buck is available in reducing carbon emissions in India. Let's go. Let's put in place the right policy framework. Let's say the government is committed to net zero targets. Let's have a climate change commission that's focusing on resolving these coordination issues that exist and these coordination problems that exist across multiple actors in our policy space. And let's create a very attractive market environment for investments to come in. And there's trillions of dollars of capital that's looking for good returns. We can deliver those good returns. And oh, by the way, we can also reduce carbon emissions and improve wealth. It's a win-win-win for everyone. And that's why I keep coming back to net zero is net positive. As an engineer, I can tell you that technology has leapfrogged a lot of these policy debates. That's the good news, folks. That is the good news. Let's follow the technologies. Let's look at where the technology cost curves are going. Who would have predicted that solar would come down in price as much as it has? If you're following the technology with battery and what's happening in batteries, it's incredible. If you look at what's happening, therefore, in electric transportation as well, because of battery costs coming down, you can envision a situation where it'll be much cheaper to drive an electric vehicle. And if your grid is entirely renewables, you will electrify their economy with green electricity very, very quickly. Now, we've got to get the policy mechanics, the nuts and bolts, as Mohua ji has correctly said, we've got to get them right, because only if we get them right are we going to reduce the risks for capital. And if we don't reduce the risks, if we have very high policy unpredictability, very high policy risks, I'm not going to invest at 8 or 10% US dollar returns. I'm going to expect 14 or 16. And that's going to reduce the amount of capital that's available. It's going to reduce the amount of projects that get funded. But let's have policy predictability. Let's have good policy frameworks in place, which is, for example, what we've done with solar. Capital flow in. We are building out our renewables system and getting to the 450 gigawatts much faster than anyone would have anticipated, because we've got the policies right on that. Even then, there are some issues, as we all know, because of discoms as well. But as I said, the good news is that technology is making a lot of these policy debates irrelevant.
Before going to general questions, Nitin, do you have a comment that you'd like to slip in? Go ahead and unmute yourself.
First, I hope that Jayant Bhai can convince his government because they have announced a very ambitious target for coal production. So I hope we can persuade this government to do that. The thing is, we need major institutional changes. The greatest problem in the renewable side is that our existing transmission and highly centralized transmission and grid management system is not suitable for decentralized power. And we need a major transformation in that. But I do hope that we can persuade your government, that our government, that they should really not count on coal as the answer to India's energy issues, except maybe for a very short period of time. The long-term energy issue answer is very different and much more exciting, interesting, and challenging for people in the world. Thank you.
So I'll let Ajay Chibber step right in there and add to the commentary with a question, and then I'll turn it back to our main speaker. Go ahead, Ajay.
No, thank you so much. This is so exciting. Thank you for the presentation, Jayant, and also for the commentary by Nitin Bhai and Mohua. And I remember we had a session like this 5 years ago at an India conference in the same institute, and how the debate has changed. I mean, we were talking then about still whether we would have 70% coal, etc. So this is so encouraging, and I'm so glad that very innovative politicians like you, Jayant, are leading the charge on this. I saw a debate the other day in the Center for Social and Economic Progress, and they were still talking about net zero by 2080 or something like that. So I think you're moving the needle forward in a very big way here. And but I love the terminology, the Wiki Economy, the net zero Bharat, I think is a winner. But I still have this question, so is it money? Is it the policy framework? Is it vested interest with stranded assets that will be held back? Is it just bureaucratic, inertia in India, which is of course very heavy? Where do you all see sort of, or all of the above? I mean, what shall hold us back? I mean, and where do we see the big blockages in this?
Ajay, I have a somewhat more positive view on all of this. What we are going through right now is the classic policy sort of debate and discussion evolution that you see when profound changes are underway. So you will have different folks with different points of view, different perspectives, and over a period of discussion, which maybe several years, 3, 4, 5 years, what happens is a consensus develops, perspective develops, and people then move towards that policy outcome. So right now, this is all very new, exactly to what you were saying, Ajay, because these technology changes have just started to happen. It's only in the last couple of years that round-the-clock solar has come down below the price of coal, that the price of electric vehicles has come below the price of fossil-driven vehicles. All that has just happened in the last year or two, and that's opened up these possibilities for debate. And that's why I see it as my job to put the headline out there: net zero is net positive, get a net zero carbon bill out there, so that the Overton window, the policy window, can open on these discussions, and we can evolve ourselves to a point where this becomes, the consensus view as opposed to the unconventional view, which is what it is right now. So we are moving towards, I hope, that consensus where we recognize that simply for our sake, for the sake of competitiveness, for the sake of our people, we should move towards the green frontier and not worry too much about what other countries are doing or what we can expect from other countries. If we put a house in order, if we have the right policies, the capital will flow in very fast, as it has flowed in for many other sectors, whether it's IT services, whether it's for e-commerce, whether it's for pharma. Capital has flown into the Indian economy. Whenever we provided good opportunities, the capital will come. We have to get our policy right. We have to show and be very, very clear with our overall thinking that we are going in this direction. And all this stuff will start to happen. And yes, we will need things like the Climate Change Commission to be able to accelerate and jumpstart certain industries and deal with some of these coordinate issues that are going to be quite natural. So I have a very positive view of all of this, Ajay. It's not that anything is holding us back. We are going through the natural evolution of policies when the world changes.
Any other views on the panel? Great, then I'll just move on to the question from Shamadas Banerjee, who asks, should India set up a specialized green finance institution to finance private sector projects instead of relying on the inefficient public sector banks? And he goes on to actually ask the question about high carbon prices to discourage fossil-fired investments, and should this be complemented by sector-specific efficiency standards? So a kind of list of potential policies to report on.
Yeah, we already have, these kinds of financing institutions. We set up the National Investment and Infrastructure Fund, NIF, which is very focused on green investments. They're leading a lot of efforts in that regard. And in fact, majority of their investments becoming green investments. So they're doing that. We've also set up a national DFI through a bill in Parliament. And I, in fact, led the debate on that in Parliament myself. That bill has been passed. We are creating a DFI. And again, that focus, a lot of what that DFI is going to focus on is going to be on green investments. So we are setting up those, those financing institutions. And I think what's going to happen, and you're already seeing that with the central banks, that all investing in the future is going to become green investing. We won't really need a specialized institution because this is where the economy is headed. We need a complete top to bottom transformation of the economy, which is why I say that the green frontier model is the development model for India. It's not 20% of the economy, it's 70, 80% of the economy. And that's what all of our financing institutions will do. Now, when it comes to carbon pricing in India, we already have very high carbon pricing in India. We have very high carbon taxes on, our fuels because we have very high excise taxes. 50% of the price of petrol and diesel you buy at the pump in India is actually taxes. It's a carbon tax, if you want to call it that. We have very high prices for freight of coal. So that, of course, means that our cost of electricity goes up because we're charging a lot for the freight of coal on Indian railways. And there are, taxes on coal as well. So actually, if you look at the carbon tax in India, if you want to call it that and label it at that, we already have probably higher carbon taxes than almost any other country right now. So our carbon taxes are very high. What we are seeing in the modeling in terms of policy packages that will get us to net zero by 2050, 2060 is really 4 important policy levers. Number one, we've got to get over to renewables. 100% renewables ASAP, 2050, 2060, whenever you can. We need 100% move to an electric fleet as far as transportation is concerned. We need a global carbon trading system so that we can incent industries like cement and steel to quickly go to green hydrogen and so on. Like they have in the European Union, you start with an allowance and you bring it down over time. So you force them to transition. This is what the Climate Change Commission can do, Mohua, is put out this kind of a carbon trading system. And number 4, what we need to do is we need to make sure that we set in place a carbon tax that can deal with the fact that fossil fuel consumption is coming down. Right now, we are raising a lot of revenue from carbon taxes, from fossil fuel taxes, and we've got to, from a fiscal point of view, be able to manage that transition as well. So just managing that from a public finance perspective is going to be a very big deal for India, because both the central government and the state governments are getting a significant amount of their revenues from fossil taxes.
Well, I see Mohua has her hand up, so I'll turn it over to you, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I just wanted to ask a follow-up question to what you were just saying, Mr. Sinha. Some of the technologies will be imported. Some of the technologies, for example, the solar panels have gone down in price, mainly not due to anything India did, but for Chinese reasons. Now we are putting taxes on those for other geopolitical reasons. So there are certain policies that are raising the cost of imported green technologies. And my question to you, because I think what I'm not clear on is your attitude towards this mythical 100 billion, which is supposed to come. I mean, if the developing countries are going to get some kind of compensation for countries which went ahead and ate up all the carbon budget before the developing countries could get there. One of the things that I sort of firmly believe is that countries like India should not have to borrow expensive and take loans in order to afford imported technologies. I see a parallel with the vaccines here. It's like, if it's good for the whole world, then don't make us borrow money for the latest green technologies and spend even more than we should be spending otherwise. So this question that you raised of public finance and the Indian government acting as maybe the recipient of certain compensatory resources, which it then uses to buy down the capital cost of these green technologies, I'd just like to sort of ask you for your specific comments on that idea.
In my experience as an investor and as a policymaker, trying to fiddle with the market with those kinds of things doesn't work very well. We just don't have the subtle, sophisticated, bureaucratic finesse to be able to pull off those kinds of market interventions. So we basically just have to create an enabling framework and let it rip, as I said. And that's already happened in solar. It's already happened in so many other industries. We just basically have to get our policy framework right. And you've already seen with the kind of commitments that Shri Mukesh Ambani has made and Shri Gautam Adani has made. They're talking about investing $10 billion, $15 billion each on both solar power, as well as solar manufacturing, as well as green hydrogen. All of these things are happening naturally because they see the investment opportunities, they see the return opportunities, where the $100 billion of green climate finance can play a role for India. I mean, it has an important role to play in Africa and other countries. So, that should, of course, be pursued. But in India, there are some interventions to jumpstart markets where blended capital can reduce some of the risks early on and jumpstart the S-shaped curve. So, yes, there is some role for blended capital to play. I've written about that in Business Standard. But by and large, because we in India alone will need $100 to $150 billion a year for the next 20, 30 years, we have to make it by private sector investment. And private sector investment is going to come when the returns are good and the risks are low. So let's go about making that happen. And the moment we do that, the capital will come. The yields right now, give them 5, 8, 10% returns in dollar terms, you'll have plenty of capital.
Before we move on to the next question from Arshad Syed, I'd love to go ahead and remind the audience to put their questions into the chat. Now, Arshad's question is as follows. MIT has undertaken to do a policy study recently assessing the cost of net zero from establishing emission standards versus carbon tax. Has the Indian government considered such policy assessment or anything like it at all?
So, James, we are still at the early stages of doing this policy modeling. I recently have been in discussions with the Niti Aayog, where they've begun some of their modeling efforts. But the most sophisticated modeling, as I have said earlier, is still happening in the think tanks at the Fletcher School at the Climate Policy Lab, headed up by Professor Gallagher, at Cambridge Econometrics, and at the World Resources Institute. To my own experience, and I have spoken at length to the climate scientists. My own background, by the way, is in operations research, which is where I got my graduate degree. So modeling energy economy systems is kind of where I cut my professional teeth. So it's a lot of fun for me to get deep into these models again. But what I found when I started looking at this about 2 years ago is that the work that had been done in the US and China had largely only been done looking at energy systems. So the coupling of energy systems to the macro economy, the impact of a green transformation in terms of GDP, jobs, and health, that modeling had not yet been done. And generally the macro models that exist in India, Ajay and Nitin Bhai and others know well, are CGE models that are all equilibrium driven models where you assume the world is already at equilibrium. So any perturbation is suboptimal because it's taking you away from equilibrium. So we needed different kinds of models to look at these kinds of long-term 20, 30-year projections. And so one group of people has been working with IO models, input-output models, which is what the energy innovation model is. Another group of people are using systems dynamics models. Some people have coupled IO models to systems dynamics models and have looked at that. That's what Energy Innovations is doing right now. They've got a systems dynamics, energy systems model, and they've got an input-output driven by a certain set of econometric variables and so on the macro side. And the energy modeling is then driving the economic modeling. And then we're looking at the composite impact of all of that. So that's what's been done in India, where we've had to calibrate and spend a year kind of making sure those models are providing us through back testing and forward testing, a reasonable set of results. And of course, we'd be very happy, this group of sort of loose collective of modeling experts to work with folks at MIT or anywhere else where they want to look at the integrated impact of a green transformation on the energy system as well as the macro economy. So that's kind of the modeling effort. We have a big launch of this detailed modeling work we've done at COP26 in Glasgow, where 3 of the modeling groups are going to be submitting their papers and getting into it in quite a bit of detail. So the more the merrier when it comes to the modeling. But the good news I will say as a modeler myself is that with different models, different approaches, different assumptions, we are getting very consistent results. The numbers are a little off depending on which approach you're using, but all of them are sort of pointing towards net zero as net positive. And the economic intuition on it is very straightforward, because if you start with the proposition that these are more efficient technologies, that they are giving you the same unit of power at a lower cost, and then if you invest behind them, obviously the economy becomes more productive and grows and jobs are created. And of course, we know that fossil fuels are driving air pollution. So at a very intuitive level, the logic is very simple. And then we can go into it in great detail over the years, different policy packages, what impacts are there in different sectors, and what's the net of reducing fossil fuel jobs versus increasing green jobs. So we've done all of that, the puts and the takes on it. And that's why I can say with some confidence as a modeler myself that net zero is turning out to be net positive.
Now, I thought with his hand up there, so I will turn it over to you, Nitin.
Thank you very much. Well, I think I just wanted to bring in is net positive, but a 1.5 degree change in temperature will still require adaptation. Will still require work on resilience, because you will have more high temperature events taking place. You will have more rain on fewer days. Water instability is there. You will have a sea level rise. And therefore, I would say that this is one area where concessional finance would be helpful. This is an area, particularly when you're getting down to people at the bottom of the pyramid. This is an area where it would be very helpful. And there are areas of adaptation and resilience which will also serve mitigation. If you do something on agricultural productivity, on water use, on urban design, it will serve both the purposes of mitigation as well as adaptation and resilience. So I buy the argument about net positive in terms of opportunities for growth and jobs, but I must also recognize that it will require work on issues like temperature instability, water instability, temperature rise, sea level rise, and so on. And that's where concessional finance becomes more important. But the biggest challenge is changing the policy environment. Take energy. The energy system in the world is built around the great giants. And we are looking at a world where 20% of world trade will disappear. 20% of world trade is on fossil fuels. That disappears. Are those people going to sit there and accept it lying down? I don't think so. You're going to face a lot of resistance from the ones who will be stuck with stranded assets. 80% of coal and about half of oil reserves will have to remain unused if we want to get to the net zero that it ought to get to if we want humanity to survive.
Response?
I had a very interesting meeting with the Saudi foreign minister just about a week ago, speaking of folks that have very large oil reserves. And he told me that one of their highest priorities is this green transformation, and that they want to become a hub for renewable energy, because the writing is on the wall, because we all realize that this is unsustainable. And again, the transition is not happening overnight. We're talking about a 30, 40-year transition that needs to happen. But what we need to do now, and this is why it's a decisive decade, what we need to do now, whether it is countries like Saudi Arabia that have very large hydrocarbon reserves, or countries like India, which have very large renewable energy reserves, all of us have to start to bend the curve. We've got to start to take action now, build no more coal plants, put in place mandates for electric vehicles. So for example, the European Union has said by 2035 that every car that's going to be sold is going to be an electric vehicle that's going to be sold. So those are the kinds of decisions we need to make now, because if we don't make those decisions now, then our manufacturing can't gear up to make electric vehicles in those numbers and so on and so forth. Today in India, we are selling about 15, 16, 17 million two-wheelers a year, and they're all petrol two-wheelers. For us to have 18 or 20 million electric two-wheelers means we've got to start building the factories for it today, so that in 10 years from now, they're all electric. So that is why these investments have to happen now. Similarly, we sell 3 to 4 million cars a year. Those will also have to be converted into electric. Those factories have to be built right now. If we are going to be able to have all of our energy needs supplied by solar plants and by offshore wind and so on, and we need for that, we need the grids transformed, as Nitin Bhai just said. That work has to happen now. We've got to make this generational transfer, but that work has to start now, and that's why this is a decisive decade, which is what the UN has also said, so that 30 or 40 years from now, we can make that transition. And if we make the transition now smoothly, gradually, and a just transition, then we can manage it. If we have to make the transition in a helter-skelter way 10 or 15 or 20 years from now, it will certainly not be a just transition. It will be a very unjust, awkward, and violent transition, which none of us would like for our succeeding generations. And that's why it's so important to have these kinds of discussions and to debate this and to understand where the science and technology is taking us and really get behind that.
So I have a question from Leela Reina to you. She first thanks you for your presentation, but then goes on to say, given the detrimental impacts of climate change being faced by the most vulnerable and poor, like Bolameta and Gita in India, where does action, finance, and investments on climate adaptation fit into your net zero carbon model? If we're arguing private sector will crowd in investments, how will they commit to investments in climate adaptation, which may not be financially profitable, versus investments in green industry mitigation, renewable energy investments? And I link that to a question by Shamadas, who we referred to earlier. What is the government of India doing about improving resiliency for vulnerable people who will be affected by high temperatures, floods, droughts, extreme weather events?
Yeah, so both adaptation and resilience are massive problems, and we must address them, and we will address them. But really what we're talking about today, the net zero is net positive, is all about mitigation. And of course, as I said, that if we unleash these market forces and we let technology work, we will be able to go through and make this green transformation happen. There are policy steps we need to take. We need a climate change commission. We need to commit to a net zero target, et cetera, et cetera. By the way, China is doing all of that, right? They have also seen the writing on the wall. Saudi Arabia is doing this, as I said. So we should also recognize this and move in that direction. So I think there, as long as we have the right policies and we say that this is what we are committed to, I think market forces and technologies will take us there, as they have taken us there through every transition, whether it's the digital transformation or anything else that we've done in the past. So that is in fact the only way. Governments can't get us there. It is markets that will get us there, and so we have to motivate and incent those markets. So that's as far as mitigation is concerned, getting to net zero. Now, when it comes to adaptation and it comes to resilience, you're absolutely right. The Bhola Mehtos and the Gita Arons are the most vulnerable. They are the ones that are suffering the most from drought. They are the ones that are suffering the most from flooding. They are the ones that are suffering the most from erratic monsoons. And we have a lot of work to do to be able to supply them with the tools and the instruments so that they can get through all of this. Now, there's hundreds of things that are going on in this regard. I don't want to get into all those details. I'll just give two very quick examples. Number one, just yesterday, I participated in a program virtually with the Honorable Prime Minister, where we released 40 climate-resistant seeds so that with less water and less pesticide, we can grow as good paddy as we are doing right now. So yes, we have to invest in those kinds of climate-resistant agriculture and technologies so that we can deal with those and adapt to those changes. So that's one example. The second example is what we've been doing with national disaster management, which is a capability and a resilience that we've been building up in India. When we had a cyclone come around 10, 20 years ago, tens of thousands of people would die in our cyclones. But now, even though we are being hit by more frequent cyclones, because our disaster management capabilities have improved so much now, we are getting through these cyclones with very limited loss of lives. 10s or 20 people will sadly die when we used to have 10 or 20,000 people dying. And that's the kind of resilience that we're trying to build up as well. Now, it's hard in a country like India to be able to do that well. But all in all, I would say that there are many, many efforts underway, both on adaptation as well as in building resilience. It's something that we recognize very well that we have to address from a policy point of view.
So now the last question from the audience, which I think is in some sense the hardest question. As I look up above us, I'm in Virginia right now as we sit. Above us is West Virginia, over to the side is West Virginia. So there are two final questions in chat I'll approach you with, and they are: India continues to build and operate coal-powered plants. Does it have a time-bound plan to close them? And then he goes on to give an opinion that they should be closed. Arshad Shahid says to everyone, recently China had made a policy decision to stop financing coal-fired power plants overseas. Do you expect India to move in this direction in the near future? So the tough trade-off question for you, sir.
So I think the last coal-fired power plant being built in India is actually being built in Hazaribagh. It's a 4,000 megawatt ultra thermal power plant, supercritical, that's being built in Patratu, right in front of my eyes. And NTPC is building it. It's a massive investment on their part, almost $3 billion. And so I'm very familiar with what their plans are with respect to coal. NTPC is not building anymore. They have no other coal-fired power plants that are coming up. And to the best of my knowledge, at least, nobody else is building coal plants anymore in India. All the action has moved to renewables. All the action has already moved to solar. So even though there's no de jure action or law saying no more coal-fired power plants, de facto no more coal-fired power plants are being built. A lot of that is happening because of capital, not wanting to invest and support the construction of more coal-fired power plants. So I think we are already moving in that direction. And as I said, the latest bids for round-the-clock solar are proving that the price of round-the-clock solar now is lower than the price of baseload coal-fired power plants. And as I said, that does not include the negative externalities, which I can tell you about in detail, coming as I do from a coal-bearing district. So, so already, I think that that train has left the station, if you will, right? and that's kind of where we are in that. Now, there was a separate question about why is it that we are producing more coal in India. We are actually trying to substitute for imported coal. So there's a lot of coal that's being imported into India. I think if I remember the numbers correctly, we use about 1 billion tons of coal a year, of which 700 million tons is produced domestically and 300 million tons is imported. And so what we're trying to do is to avoid importing coal, which is very expensive. It's driving up our import bill quite a bit. And we do have the domestic coal reserves. So even as we have 30, 40 years of coal ahead of us still, let's power those next 30, 40 years of coal with domestic coal rather than imported coal. Let's use up whatever we have and let's make sure the revenues remain here, the jobs remain here, as opposed to exporting them to other coal producing countries. So that is our goal. And again, as I said, markets and capital and technology have moved on. And what we now need to do is to support them and facilitate that transformation as best as possible so that we can, in fact, get to the green frontier.
Thank you, Jayant. A final minute from you, Nitin. Unmute.
I just want to say that on a positive note, I've been involved in this for over 30, 40 years. I'm an old man. I'm 80 years old. I'm an old man. I've been involved in this for about 40 years now. And I did not think that when we started talking about all of these things in the mid-80s, in the Brundtland Commission, later at the Rio Conference and so on, that we would get this far. And what I find impressive is that we are today, because of the impact of science on decision-making, we have been able to persuade governments to take action because of things that may happen 50 years from now or 100 years from now. Now, to me, this is a formidable achievement. And now that the market is also working in that same direction, we are in a much better position. Now I don't have to write reports and raise awareness. People talk about coal. Today, the coal plant companies are suffering because they can't operate the plants. The other plants are replacing them. So really, the market will take care of that dimension. What we have to worry about is how do we then take care of the broader dimension of institutional change, of policy change, of coping with the changes in the ecosystem, which will arise inevitably because of 1.5 degrees. But my overall sense is optimistic, not because everything is right now, but it has gone much further than I thought it would when we started the whole process 30 years ago.
Thank you. Now, Mohua, a final thought?
Yep, just a final thought. I very much appreciate this discussion. I think that the key thing is the difficult little, the coordination that's needed for everybody to put the policies in place and create the enabling environment that will act as an incentive and not a disincentive. And I'm sure we can get there, but we just need to get there quickly. And I think support is needed for the institutional framework that's going to see all this through.
Thank you. And now, Chairperson.
It's been wonderful. I'm really thankful to Jayant and to Nitin and Mohua and to the participants. I think we've had a very rich audience as well this time, asking such brilliant questions. But I'm very optimistic, and also I'm so glad that people of the caliber of Jayant, with all his knowledge and global experience, are leading the charge in India on this. I'm very hopeful, but I also found that the discussion, the comments that were made on adaptation and resilience are very, very important. The problem for us in India, as Jayant's slide showed, is the share of vulnerable employment in India is so high, one of the highest in the world. And we saw that with the pandemic, with all those migrants leaving the cities. And now what we are seeing is some of that happening on a much slower boil, but it's happening all over the country as well. So I think this awareness is there now. A lot will have to be done, but I'm so enthused by this discussion and the way you have framed it, Jan, and put it across to us. Really, I'm so glad. Thank you.
Well, this brings to a close our first episode of Envisioning India this new academic year. So I just say thank you again for all of your marvelous discussions and say goodbye, good night, good morning from the Elliott School in Washington, D.C.